Well, how great it is to be with you once again on my daily dose. You might remember on last week, it was our 100th episode. I began to tell you something about my transplant story from birth until now. Now, on that episode, I shared with you how I was born March the 12th, 1975, and just several days after being born, the doctors discovered something was terribly wrong with my heart. And after doing some tests and such as that, they found out I had a condition known as transposition of the great vessels of the great arteries. And they decided then the only treatment for that would be to do a surgery that they hoped to do upon me becoming a year old. Now, the problem was at 6 months old, I hadn't grown very much. I had actually gotten much, much worse, much weaker. I was constantly stopping to breathe. They called me a blue baby because I was generally blue all the time from lack of oxygen. And I was having to be resuscitated fairly regularly. So the doctor suggested they go ahead and do the surgery at 6 months old, even though at that time, 1975, I would be the youngest baby ever to have open heart surgery in the state of Alabama. They also told my parents, you might remember, that they would only give them about a 10% chance that this surgery would be successful and even that I would come out of those doors alive. But again, their child was dying nonetheless. They had a decision to do nothing and I would die, or to do something and I had a possibility, as slim as it was, to live. So the doctors went ahead and did the surgery, and of course it was very successful. And I remember telling you from that point on, basically I had no problems. I had regular doctor visits to attend to and such as that, but basically the surgery was an extreme success. Now they had always doubted that I would live out of childhood or past my teenage years, and especially doubted I would ever live to adulthood, but I've been able to accomplish that. I remember telling you it was on my 18th birthday, I believe it was, that my transplant surgeon had called my mother's house just randomly and asked her very carefully if I was even still alive. Of course, she was overjoyed to tell them that I was just fine and that I was doing well and working and such as that. And so they were excited about that also. Now, fast forward several years, I again had no problem in adulthood. I continued on until I was about 32 or so years old, and the doctors began to see certain signs, but again, nothing significant. But they went ahead and warned me that by the time I was 40, I would probably still meet with some difficult times. Now, we didn't know exactly what that would be, but nonetheless, we were looking for that. And so I began to go to the doctor about every 3 years or so, which was my routine anyway. And the doctors began to discover certain things, but again, nothing significant. Now, finally, if you fast forward in things, just to make brevity of my life at that point, I moved from Legacy Cabinets, where I'd worked for about a decade, had begun preaching the gospel, and made my way to the Memphis School of Preaching, where I trained to be a gospel preacher from 2004 to 2006, and then finally moved back to Alabama and ultimately to Philadelphia, Mississippi, which was my first full-time local work. Now, I hadn't been there in Mississippi very long at all when we decided on one evening to have some of the elders over and their families and to treat them to a grill out, or we were going to grill hamburgers and such as that at our home. It was about February of 2009 that evening when, just before they arrived, Jennifer noticed me looking funny, as she said. I began to reach up and hold my neck here to see what my heartbeat was, to check my pulse and such. And when she questioned me about that, I admitted to her that my heart was skipping beats. Now, it wasn't just a simple skip, if you will. Basically, my heart would beat really hard or fast for a few seconds and then stop for 15 or 20 seconds, no beats at all, and then join back in beating once again. And so immediately, as you can realize, the grill out was canceled, the barbecue was canceled, and we made our way to the local emergency room there at Neshoba General Hospital in Philadelphia. Now, upon arriving there, they really, after knowing my history, hearing a little bit about my surgery at 6 months, my transposition, which they weren't familiar with at all, they were very afraid to even mess with me or touch me. As a matter of fact, the doctor that was on call that night basically just kind of sat behind a glass window looking into my room just in a panic and calling the doctors in Birmingham trying to find out what to do. Now, as different members of my family and our friends and the elder that was supposed to come over to eat with us came to the hospital to check on me, they were all really aggravated with me because as I would sit there and talk to them in the bed, my heart would just stop, and on the monitor there above my head, we would just flatline for 15, 20 seconds at a time as if I had died, but of course I was continuing to talk. And I thought it was funny. I got a joke out of it, but they weren't exactly laughing. They were afraid. So finally, nonetheless, the doctors there in Birmingham had asked them to do a 12-lead EKG just to gather some more information as to what was going on and decide whether or not I needed to be moved to Birmingham or if I could be treated there. Now, the problem was Neshoba General Hospital didn't have a 12-lead EKG. They only had a 4-lead. And so they had to make do on that night. And they went ahead and did that, sent the information to the doctors in Birmingham. And they basically said I need to come immediately to UAB Hospital. So we left the hospital. We went on our own accord. They wanted me in an ambulance, but we chose to do it this way. and Jennifer drove me over to UAB. And of course, we got here in the early hours of the next morning. I went on into UAB that day, and they went ahead and checked me out, did some tests and such, and decided I was having something known as PVCs, which is exactly what I've described. Your heart beats regular, then rather quickly, stops for several seconds, and then starts back up again. They told me that as long as those things were not sustained or continuous, it wasn't that dangerous and there was nothing much to worry about. However, they sent me home with a heart monitor just to be sure. They wanted to plan for some more testing and such as that, and they went ahead and scheduled some of those things. As a matter of fact, they'd hoped to do a test on April the 29th, 2009, a heart cath, to exactly see what was going on. Now, the problem was this. They knew more than we knew. The doctors had already began to think about it, suggest some things and such as that, and they were really more worried than I ever was. Now, after we arrived home there in Philadelphia, again awaiting that heart cath in April the 29th, which was several weeks out, by the way, you might notice, at that point in time, we began to try to understand exactly what was going on. And the doctor said the reason the heart cath was planned for so far out is because they refused to go in and do a heart cath, which is basically routine for some people, but they refused to do that because of my, if you will, my different anatomy and such, the way that my heart was positioned, the way that it was hooked up or plumbed, if you will. And so they refused to touch me without what they called an electrical team, a plumbing team, and an open heart team in the operating room while they did it. So it was going to be rather dangerous. Now, again, that was kind of frightening, but still nonetheless, I thought, or assumed at least, if they wouldn't find a whole lot, they'd go in, I'd be fine. And so as we were approaching that day and such, I was still wearing the heart monitor there for that month and waiting on that. And the doctors called my wife at home one day and said, we really need him to come back to the hospital. And that's because I was going into something known as VTAC, ventricular tachycardia. Now, we didn't understand at the time exactly what that was. But as they began to describe that to us, basically the doctor put it this way. He said, that's what we call, as in the medical field, as the rhythm of death. He said, if this is sustained for very long at all, a few seconds or, 20, 15, 20 seconds nonetheless, it can kill you. He said, this is the rhythm that causes men just to drop, land on the ground, and it's over. They're dead. And so that's not something I wanted to face. So they began to discuss then that it'd probably be needful, or at least helpful, if I went in, had the heart cath done, and just to see exactly where I was. Now, the thing is, that heart cath being April the 29th, they were afraid I wasn't going to do very well between now and then. So I went ahead and bumped it up to April the 15th, 2009. I went in for that heart cath that day, and we really didn't expect a whole lot. We expected, again, to know about the PVCs, to have the occasional non-sustained VTAC and such as that. But I wasn't worried. I don't know if my family was that worried, perhaps more than me, but we're not that worried at that point. I go in for the heart cath, and they suggested, there's probably some narrow places, scar tissue and such from the surgery years ago. We're going to go in and balloon that. We'll fix it, and he'll be fine. That's what they expected to do. But if they went in at that occasion, I was in there for, instead of 45 minutes to an hour like typical heart cath will be, I was in there for more 4 to 4.5 hours, and including recovery more about 5.5 or 6. And the doctors came out. Of course, they're acting strangely. They want to talk to us all by the time I wake up and such as that. And they told me right then I was in stage 4 heart failure. They were shocked. They were surprised. They were in doubt of how I even made it into that hospital. I'd walked in basically the day or two before, and they didn't have any idea how I was able to do that. They were surprised at how weak my heart was. The cardiac output at that time was very, very low, and so they were very concerned. Now, they also had the secondary concern of the VTAC. Apparently, they had had some episodes of that had went bad in the cath lab also, and so they're really worried about that. So I've got VTAC going on. I've got the medications that they're going to give me. I'm also having some fluid buildup by that point, around the heart and such, and so they're really worried. So they decided at that point in time, I'm having to look at some notes for some dates, but they decided at that point in time that it was needful that I have an ICD implanted sometime in the near future. So the best they could do to schedule that, however, was June the 16th. So we're going from April the 15th from June the 16th. So quite a span of time in between there. They said that's the best they could do, so they had that scheduled. Now, in the intermediate of that time, I had several things going on. I was so blessed to still be preaching the gospel and such, and I had a gospel meeting going on at the Spring Valley congregation. I speak of them often in Tuscumbia, Alabama. Now, that was supposed to go from June the 7th through the 12th. While I was there, about the second day or so, maybe on Monday or Tuesday, my heart rate began to go really high. as far as when I was resting. I would lay down in the bed, be laid down for several minutes, 30 minutes or so, and my heart rate would still run around 140. I began to run a temperature of about 102 and such, and I just felt terrible. Of course, they called me in some medications and such as that, trying to help me out. But as the week went on, especially till the Friday night, the last night of the meeting, I ended up in the emergency room that night up in Tuscumbia. Of course, they called down to UAB as the other hospitals would, and they decided that that ICD that was scheduled for the 16th needed to really be bumped up. And so they decided right then that it was going to be necessary to get that in as soon as possible. And so before long, I was sent home to Philadelphia, but only just for a day or two on to UAB for the ICD. Now, when that occurred, at least, this is the way I've got it kind of jotted down here, the way I remember, they discovered at that point in time, not only was the ICD necessary for my rhythms, not only was my heart weak and such as that, my cardiac output was very low, but they also discovered at that point in time that my muscle of my heart was getting stiff. And what that meant is that the heart was contracting fairly well, but when it tried to relax and to refill with blood, it wasn't being able to do that very well. It wasn't very efficient at all, at least. And so that was a real problem. You know, they said we can treat your plumbing issues with possible stents and such as that, which of course they couldn't actually. They had tried that earlier, I didn't mention, but the stents weren't going to work. The ICD was going to do its job as far as the electrical and protect me to an extent, but at the same time, there's nothing that can be done for the hardening of the heart. So we went ahead and came home after that, and I think it was just within several days of that, one of my doctors called my wife and asked, was I at home? Of course, I wasn't. He basically said, well, good. And he began to tell her, he said, I really believe he's going to need a heart transplant more sooner than later. I think y'all are going to have to make some very tough decisions in the near future as to what you're going to do. And of course, that made her afraid and didn't make me feel real comfortable nonetheless. It's not something I look forward to, but it's something I was going to have to deal with. So if you fast forward on through this, and I'm just skipping down, around September of 2009, and we've gone from February of 2009 to September, so not really that many months spanning in here, we lost our health insurance. I was on what's known at that time as a COBRA plan, which was me paying my bill to extend my insurance for my legacy cabinets from earlier to extend it on for a period of time. And I lost that time. It run out. And so I was now without health insurance. And at that point in time, they did several things. They tried to work it out so that I could continue to come to UAB, but that wasn't working out very well. And they were going to have to be moving me back over to a hospital in Mississippi because at that point I got Mississippi Medicaid, and they needed to be able to pay for it that way. But we found out several things. One, Medicaid wasn't going to pay for the entire heart transplant. I was going to be left with about 20% of that, which was going to be a huge bill. Secondary to that, the treatment, and I'm not trying to make fun of anybody, but the treatment in Mississippi, and I won't go into all the details, was far less quality than what I was receiving at UAB. As I told the doctor there, really to his face, I said, your entire building would fit in my doctor's office in Birmingham's waiting room. That's really how it was. They weren't familiar with the transposition. They weren't familiar with the ICD I had implanted. They weren't managing me very well. They weren't doing an awful lot for me. But nonetheless, I had a heart transplant evaluation. That's just to find out if I needed one. I had one of those done in Mississippi. Now, I had started one in Alabama just prior to being moved to Mississippi, but they did one in Mississippi, and they discovered at that time, so they said, that I had passed by just a few points. That on one of the tests, I had done just a little bit better than required, but we figured out a little bit later it wasn't so much that. It was that they didn't want to do a heart transplant without me having any substantial medical insurance. And so I was basically being denied for that. And so at that point in time, I made it my life's work. Nearly every day, I would call up anybody and everybody I could. I talked to the head of Medicare. I talked to the head of Medicaid. I talked to different senators from all over the region that were dealing with such things in Washington. I talked to the governor's wife personally, the governor of Mississippi, Haley Barbour's wife, on the phone, and did all that I could trying to find a way to get me on Medicare earlier. I was on Medicaid, but I needed Medicare, which would ultimately pay for my heart transplant. So here I am. I'm needing a heart. I'm dying without a heart. And I'm getting very little treatment because I don't have proper insurance. And I know there are millions of people around this world, and you can say what you'd like to about the Affordable Care Act and such. At the end of the day, so far at least, the treatment you get without a quality health insurance is lower. We might as well swallow the pill. It's lower without a quality insurance than it is with. I had a friend of mine just on last week that went to the doctor. He has Medicaid, and he sat behind everybody in that room at least until everybody had come and gone, and then he still never was treated. He finally left the doctor or the emergency room. It really was, and so I know how it is. But that's where we were. So as you can imagine, we're very afraid by this point. Basically, I found out that I need a heart transplant. They're trying to list me for a heart transplant. They said I needed one immediately, but at the same time, I'm being denied. And one of the last things the doctor over at UMC in Jackson, Mississippi told me, they said, you just come back in 3 months and we'll check on you again. Well, my UAB doctors are saying I have a matter of months to live, and the ones over here are saying, well, come back in 3 months, we'll check you out. I don't know who's right. I know God's in control all the while, but I'm not sure exactly what to do. So we're beginning to get nervous about that. We're beginning to get afraid. So on November the 8th, 2009, I formally resigned my preaching duties in Philadelphia. Now, the reasoning behind that was simple. One, I couldn't keep them up very well, and two, I had to do what I could to maintain my disability and to try to get on Medicare. That was my only hope. And there's a 2-year waiting period between receiving disability and receiving Medicare for anyone outside of those in renal failure. Now, for whatever reason, if you're in kidney/renal failure, you're immediately put on to the Medicare system, the health plan at least. But any other condition, including a heart that needs transplanting, couldn't get it. So long story short, we ended up traveling as far as to Washington to sit down and try to talk that over with one of our state senators that was representing us up there. And that was really to no avail. He was sympathetic. I even sent a letter to Barack Obama at the time. He sent me back a very sympathetic letter. I appreciate it. I still have it. And I think it was very personal. He seemed to be a personally written letter, if you will. But at the same time, no one was helping. So we were in dire straits by that point. Now, at this point in time, it was around January the 22nd. I'm just moving on a little bit. January the 2nd, 2010, they decided they ought to repeat the heart cath from earlier. They wondered if I was doing better or worse. Now, symptomatically, I was doing much worse. I was sleeping most all the time. I had no energy whatsoever. Not all the time, but sometimes I'd get up to preach, and I never missed any occasion save one to preach the gospel on the Lord's Day. But one or two of the times that I got up to preach, I had intention of preaching an entire sermon. 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes in, I just completely lose my ability to do it. I couldn't stand there any longer. I couldn't breathe long enough to do it, so things were getting harder. But nonetheless, they wanted to repeat the cath. Now, at that point in time, they scheduled the cath and decided that it would be on January the 22nd. They did that. That cath went fairly smoothly as far as time at least. And they brought us back in on January the 29th to give us the results. And here's what they said. They said the heart is much, much weaker now than it was then. One of the numbers that stuck out in their mind, they said the average heart of a man your size bumps about 5 liters of blood per minute. That's average. That's not someone in great shape, not someone who's weak, but average 5 liters of blood per minute. They said your heart's only pumping 1.4 liters of blood per minute. 1.4 up against 5. And so I was about a fifth as strong as I needed to be at that point in time. So they knew things were getting worse. And so that's when I continued to call these people, to beg, to plead, to try to get something done so I could get on Medicare again. Time was seemingly running out. Now, fast forward just a little bit more. On May the 28th, 2010, I went for yet another heart transplant evaluation, which would have basically been my third, really. A partial one at UAB, a complete one at UMC in Jackson. I'm back to UAB now because we decided to physically move back. We got to move back to the state of Alabama just so I can get the care that I need, the quality of care. And also I'm looking now that my Medicare has finally began to catch up. And so I'm trying to get evaluated for a transplant. That's really kind of where I got to at that point in time. Now, I'll tell you more about this on another occasion. That covers really a lot more ground than you can understand, and I've had to skip an awful lot, but I do appreciate your attention. Now, here's what I want to consider with you, however, is this. I learned during all of that time, and I was constantly reminded of it, of several things. One being that God always provided for me. You can see the end of the story sitting here. I know the end of the story and such as that, and I know how things worked out. But I also learned by that God is not only providing, He's providing in His ways. Some of the things that I hoped would happen, if it would have been up to me back in 2009 when this problem was really first beginning, if you will, it hit the fan, I would have been transplanted immediately. But that hadn't happened. Matter of fact, you well know that didn't happen until 2013. Even though at one point in time the doctors had given me, back in 2009, about 12 to 18 months to live, I made it to 2013. So I learned that God's ways are not my ways. His ways are very different. And then finally I learned, and I'll mention more about this on another occasion probably, it's not our duty as humans in the plan of God to try to take care of things ourselves. And if you will, to light our own fire. Isaiah chapter 50, verse 11 talks about that. If you want to look that up, Isaiah 50 and verse 11 talks about a man who kindles his own fire. And that is, he tries to make things happen his way by his plan, in spite of what God's plan may be. And he says, that man will lie down. It's the last phrase of verse 11. That man will lie down in sorrow. And friends, I'm going to tell you, I had to lay down in sorrow several times in my pity parties and such, worried and disgusted and everything else with what was going on in my life, in order to be awakened later to find out the plan of God was much more perfected than mine ever was. I should have kept that in mind all the while, and I did at times, but at other times it's very difficult to do. But again, I'll try to rejoin this discussion about at this point, and I apologize if I've gotten some things out of order or made it confusing, but that's the basic gist of what's going on from 2009 up until about 2010, at least up into this date of March the 28th. So we'll catch up there on another program. Again, I thank you very much for being with me on my daily dose, and I always pray that you'll be encouraged